The night my adoptive father's will was read, my two brothers didn't look at me. They looked at each other. And when the lawyer said my name instead of theirs, something in that room shifted so fast, it almost felt physical. Before I tell you what happened next, if you've ever been the one person in the family who didn't quite fit, go ahead and comment or subscribe. Not for sympathy, for solidarity. Because this story isn't about money, it's about being excluded until suddenly you're not. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 31 years old, and I make a living capturing other people's truths through a lens. I'm a documentary photographer. I've spent the last decade shooting stories across the Southwest, immigration routes along the Arizona border, coal towns in eastern Utah, tribal water rights protests in northern New Mexico. I don't photograph weddings. I don't stage happiness. I document what people try to hide. Maybe that's why my adoptive parents chose me. Or maybe that's why my brothers never did. I was adopted at age 7 by Richard Hart and Margaret Hart, a wealthy couple in Santa Fe who owned a private equity firm called Hart Capital Management. Their biological sons, Daniel Hart and Christopher Hart, were 10 and 12 when I arrived. Daniel was the polished one, always in debate club, always first to speak. Christopher was quieter, observant, calculating. They never hit me, never screamed. They just made it clear I was temporary. At dinner, my mother, Margaret, would say things like, "We're so lucky to have given you this life, Evelyn." Not cruel, just precise. A reminder. Daniel would smirk and add, "Don't forget where you came from." I never did. I came from foster care in Albuquerque. 3 homes in 4 years. A garbage bag of clothes. The Hart Mansion on Camino del Monte felt unreal at first. 6 bedrooms, a courtyard fountain, oil paintings in the hallways. But belonging is not square footage. When I turned 18, the subtlety ended. It was Daniel who said it outright. We were in the study. Richard was traveling. Margaret was at a fundraiser. Daniel leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "You should probably think about moving out after graduation." Christopher stood behind him, silent but present. Why, I asked. Daniel shrugged. "You've had your shot. Mom and Dad did their charity thing. Now it's time for the real heirs to step up." I remember the word heirs more than anything else. I left 2 weeks after my high school graduation. Margaret cried. Richard hugged me tightly and slipped a check into my hand. $25,000. A head start, he said quietly. Daniel didn't show up to say goodbye. Christopher watched from the balcony. That was 13 years ago. I built everything from there. Scholarships to the University of Arizona. Side jobs. Grants. I slept in my car once during a photo project in West Texas because I refused to quit. By 28, my work had been featured in National Geographic and The Atlantic. I had a modest studio in Santa Fe and contracts worth 6 figures annually. The Harts never publicly claimed me, but privately, Richard would call. "Send me your latest spread, Evie. I want to see what you're building." Margaret would ask about awards at Thanksgiving dinner, like she was reading from a script. Daniel and Christopher treated me like an awkward guest. Then came the accident. Richard and Margaret were killed instantly when their driver lost control on Interstate 25 during a snowstorm. The funeral was massive. Politicians, CEOs, charity boards. The cathedral overflowed. Daniel delivered the eulogy. Polished, controlled. Christopher stood behind him, jaw tight. I stood in the second row, excluded even in grief. The will reading was scheduled for a week later at the offices of their longtime attorney, Harold Whitmore. The room smelled like leather and old money. Daniel sat at the head of the conference table, Christopher beside him. I sat at the far end. Harold adjusted his glasses. This will was updated 9 months ago. Daniel smiled slightly. Of course it was. Harold continued. To my sons, Daniel Hart and Christopher Hart, I leave personal effects and designated trusts valued at $2 million each. Daniel's smile widened. Christopher nodded once. Harold paused. The remainder of my estate, including controlling interest in Hart Capital Management real estate holdings and liquid assets totaling approximately $82 million, shall be transferred in full to my daughter Evelyn Hart. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was calculation. Daniel's face went white. Christopher's hands curled into fists. "Excuse me," Daniel said. Harold cleared his throat. "It's explicit. Your parents revised the inheritance structure after a board review last year." Christopher leaned forward. "There has to be a mistake." Harold shook his head. "There is no mistake." Daniel looked at me then. For the first time in 13 years, he really looked at me. "You manipulated them." I didn't move. I hadn't known. That's the part that makes this almost unbearable. I hadn't known. The next 30 seconds were the beginning of a war. And the first shot hadn't even been fired yet. Daniel stood up so fast his chair hit the wall. "You think this is over?" he said, staring at me, like I'd just stolen oxygen from the room. Christopher didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "This won't stand," he said quietly. "We'll contest it." Harold Whitmore folded his hands. "Contesting a properly executed will requires grounds. Undue influence, fraud, lack of capacity. I assure you, your parents were of sound mind." Daniel turned to me. "What did you promise them?" "Nothing," I said. "That was the truth. But truth doesn't matter when inheritance is involved, especially $82 million of it. If you've ever seen how quickly family drama turns into legal warfare, the moment a will is read, you already know what came next." Within 48 hours, Daniel retained a litigation attorney named Rebecca Sloan out of Denver. Christopher hired a separate firm in Dallas, apparently not trusting his own brother enough to share counsel. That detail mattered more than they realized. I retained no one, not at first, because I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. 3 days after the reading, I received an email from Harold. "Your father left a sealed letter addressed specifically to you. He requested it be delivered after the will was executed." I drove to his office alone. Inside the envelope was my father's handwriting. Richard Hart's penmanship had always been sharp, deliberate, like everything else about him. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I imagine Daniel is furious. You were never charity. You were choice. Your brothers were raised to inherit. You were raised to build." When the board review exposed certain financial risks within the firm, it was your independent success that convinced me, not sentiment, stability. Daniel and Christopher are capable men, but they mistake entitlement for leadership. I don't. The company needs someone who understands reality. And that's you. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and put it in my bag. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I understood. 3 weeks later, I was served papers. Daniel and Christopher filed a joint petition in New Mexico probate court alleging undue influence and financial manipulation. They claimed I had emotionally isolated our parents, that I'd coerced revisions to the will. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so calculated. The petition included statements from 2 former Hart Capital executives, implying I had suspicious access to Richard during the last year. I hadn't even been in Santa Fe for most of that year. I was on assignment in Arizona. Facts don't stop ambition. That's when I hired counsel. Her name was Angela Reyes, a probate and corporate litigation attorney based in Albuquerque, 45 years old, former prosecutor, calm in a way that makes men uncomfortable. She read the petition, closed the folder, and looked at me. "They're not contesting because they think they'll win," she said. "They're contesting to bleed you dry." Explain. Probate litigation can take 2 to 4 years. Legal fees, reputational damage, media pressure. They want you exhausted. Angela leaned back. "Are you willing to fight?" "Yes." She nodded once. "Good, because this is about more than inheritance. They want control of the company." And that was the part I hadn't fully processed yet. Hart Capital Management wasn't just a pile of money. It controlled investments across renewable energy, logistics, infrastructure, and real estate in 5 states. Board seats, influence, power. $82 million wasn't the story. Authority was. Within a month, the situation escalated. Daniel leaked information to a business journalist in Denver, suggesting the will was under investigation. Headlines followed. Hart, family inheritance, dispute raises questions. My photography clients began asking cautious questions. One nonprofit delayed a contract renewal. Christopher sent a private email to several board members questioning my qualifications to oversee financial operations. It was subtle sabotage, the kind that doesn't scream revenge, but whispers instability. Angela responded methodically. We filed motions to dismiss based on lack of evidence. We subpoenaed internal communications between Daniel and Christopher, and then something surfaced that shifted the ground beneath all of us. 9 months before my parents' deaths, there had been an internal audit at Hart Capital. It revealed high-risk speculative trades authorized by Daniel without full board approval. Trades that lost $12 million. Richard had quietly covered the losses through personal capital. Christopher had known. Neither brother had disclosed it during the will reading. Angela set the audit report down on my kitchen table. This is motive, she said. For what? For why your father changed the will. For why they're panicking. That night, I sat in my studio, surrounded by framed prints from my assignments. Border crossings at dawn, coal miners at dusk, faces of people who survived systems designed to erase them. I realized something simple. My brothers never saw me as capable because they never had to survive anything. They were born inside certainty. I was not. 2 weeks before the first court hearing, Daniel called me directly. You don't understand what you're walking into, he said. I understand more than you think. Drop the case, he continued. Split the estate evenly. $30 million each. Clean resolution. No, he exhaled slowly. You're going to regret this. Maybe, but I'm not giving back something I didn't take. The first hearing was scheduled for late September in Santa Fe Probate Court. Judge Eleanor Whitaker, known for her intolerance of theatrics, would preside. Angela warned me. They'll try to paint you as the manipulative outsider. Let them. I had spent my entire life being the outsider. Courtrooms don't scare me. What scared me was something else. Because 2 days before the hearing, I received a text from an unknown number. It read, you should check what your brothers have been doing inside the company accounts this week. And attached was a screenshot. A wire transfer authorization, $5 million, initiated by Daniel Hart. The account holder listed on the document was still Hart Capital Management, which technically belonged to me now. The war had just stopped being theoretical, and this time I was ready to shoot back. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call Christopher. I called Angela Reyes. She answered on the second ring. Tell me you didn't approve a $5 million transfer. I didn't even know about it until 10 minutes ago. Send me everything. I forwarded the screenshot, the routing numbers, the timestamp, the account details. Angela went quiet, in the way experienced attorneys do when something shifts from civil dispute to potential criminal exposure. That transfer was initiated yesterday, she said finally, after the estate vested in you. Meaning if that wire cleared without authorization from the controlling shareholder, it's not probate litigation anymore. It's misappropriation of corporate funds. In plain English, theft. For a moment, I sat very still. The number 5 million looks different when it's abstract. It looks like leverage when it's attached to your own company. Angela spoke again. We need immediate injunctive relief. I'm filing an emergency motion to freeze all discretionary transfers pending the probate outcome. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Do it. Within 24 hours, we had an emergency hearing scheduled. Daniel must have sensed something, because he sent an email to the board claiming the transfer was a strategic liquidity adjustment. Christopher followed with a memo citing temporary operational restructuring. The language was polished. The timing was not. If you've ever watched powerful people scramble when control slips, you know it doesn't look dramatic. It looks administrative. Emails, conference calls, words like liquidity and fiduciary. But beneath it, panic. The emergency hearing took place in a smaller courtroom. Judge Eleanor Whitaker did not smile. Angela stood precise and unhurried. Your Honor, while the probate petition alleges undue influence, the estate has already vested in Miss Hart as sole beneficiary. Any unilateral transfer of corporate funds without her authorization raises significant fiduciary concerns. Daniel's attorney, Rebecca Sloan, countered immediately. The company's governance structure permits executive discretion pending final probate determination. Angela didn't raise her voice. The board minutes from July clearly show that Mr. Hart transferred controlling interest to Miss Hart personally. The probate petition does not suspend that authority. Judge Whitaker adjusted her glasses. Mr. Hart, did you initiate a $5 million transfer without the consent of the controlling shareholder? Daniel hesitated for half a second too long. It was a necessary business move. Yes or no? Yes. The courtroom shifted. Christopher leaned forward, as if proximity could repair damage. Judge Whitaker's voice remained level. Effective immediately, all discretionary transfers exceeding $100,000 require dual authorization. Any violation will result in contempt proceedings. The gavel hit once, clean, contained. But Daniel's expression said something else entirely. This isn't over. After the hearing, Christopher approached me in the hallway. He rarely spoke directly. That's what made it noticeable. You think this makes you qualified? He asked quietly. Qualification isn't inherited, I replied. It's demonstrated. His jaw tightened. You don't know how this world works. I held his gaze. I've documented worlds far worse than this one. He walked away. That night, Angela called again. There's something else. I was beginning to expect that phrase. We subpoenaed internal emails between Daniel and certain board members. And there's correspondence suggesting they were preparing to move assets offshore if the probate ruling upheld the will. I closed my eyes. So this wasn't about grief. It wasn't even about jealousy. It was contingency planning. How much? Preliminary estimates suggest up to $18 million earmarked for foreign subsidiaries. I exhaled slowly. They were never trying to split the inheritance. They were trying to gut the company before I could stabilize it. Angela's tone softened slightly. Evelyn, this is where you decide whether you're defending or counterattacking. Explain. We can file a derivative suit on behalf of the company alleging breach of fiduciary duty. If proven, Daniel and Christopher could be personally liable, civilly, and potentially referred for criminal review. The word criminal didn't feel heavy. It felt accurate. I didn't respond immediately. Because this wasn't revenge. This was escalation. Angela waited. What do you want to do? I thought about the night I left the Hart mansion at 18. The way Daniel had leaned against that desk. You've had your shot. I thought about Richard's letter. You were raised to build. I opened my eyes. File it. 2 days later, the derivative complaint was submitted in state court. Allegations of breach of fiduciary duty, attempted asset diversion, and financial misconduct. The press caught wind of it within hours. Hart brothers face internal investigation. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. This wasn't about an adopted daughter manipulating grieving parents. It was about executive accountability. Daniel called again. You're making a mistake, he said. No, I replied calmly. You already made it. Christopher didn't call. Instead, he did something unexpected. He reached out to someone from my past. Lucas Moreno. Lucas was a civil rights attorney I'd met years earlier while documenting housing discrimination cases in Phoenix. We'd dated briefly. It ended quietly when my assignments took me overseas. Lucas texted me that evening. Christopher Hart contacted me about representing him. I declined, But you should know they're expanding counsel. I stared at the screen. Why tell me? Because you deserve transparency. I appreciated that. And because some battles are cleaner when you know who's in the room. The probate trial date was set for early December, just before Christmas. Timing in family disputes is never accidental. Daniel and Christopher began circulating private communications to extended relatives, suggesting I had isolated our parents. A cousin sent me a cold email questioning my moral authority. I didn't respond, because reputation is loud. Evidence is quieter. 2 weeks before trial, Angela called with a new development. The forensic accounting review is complete, and there's documentation showing Daniel authorized personal real estate acquisitions through company funds over the last 3 years. Amount, approximately $4.8 million. My pulse remained steady. Christopher, complicit, co-signed on 2 transactions. Angela paused. Evelyn, if we introduce this at trial, the probate case becomes secondary. The exposure is severe, meaning prison. Potentially. I looked around my studio. Photographs lined the walls. Truth captured in black and white. You don't take a picture hoping it changes someone. You take it because it's there. Introduce it, I said. The war had officially stopped being about inheritance. Now it was about accountability. And I wasn't the one on trial anymore. The probate courtroom was full the morning the trial began. Not because anyone cared about me, because people care about $82 million. Judge Eleanor Whitaker presided without theatrics. No patience for emotional appeals. No tolerance for manipulation dressed as sentiment. That worked in my favor. Daniel arrived in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first camera kit. Christopher wore navy. Both looked composed, controlled, confident. They thought this was still about inheritance. Angela Reyes leaned toward me before proceedings began. Remember, she said quietly, they have to prove undue influence, not dissatisfaction, not regret, influence. I nodded. Across the aisle, Rebecca Sloan gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Court convened at 9 sharp. Daniel testified first. He spoke about family unity, about how our parents valued fairness, about how it would have been out of character for them to exclude biological sons. He used the word biological twice. Subtle, intentional. Rebecca guided him gently. Did you ever observe Miss Hart attempting to isolate your parents? Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes, she became increasingly present in the last year. Private meetings, closed-door conversations. I kept my face neutral. Angela rose for cross-examination. Mr. Hart, are you aware that Miss Hart was physically present in Santa Fe for a total of 14 days in the final year of your father's life? Daniel blinked once. I'm not sure of the exact number. Angela placed printed flight records into evidence. 14 days, documented by airline and assignment contracts. Daniel's jaw tightened. Angela continued. You mentioned private meetings. Are you referring to business board reviews conducted with legal counsel present? Silence. Daniel shifted. Those were different. Different. How? He didn't answer immediately. Angela didn't push further. She didn't need to. Christopher took the stand next. Quieter, more measured. He spoke about legacy, about responsibility, about how I had never expressed interest in the company before the will. Angela approached with a folder. Mr. Hart, are you familiar with the July audit findings presented to the board? Christopher's eyes flickered briefly. Yes. Did that audit reveal speculative trades authorized by your brother that resulted in $12 million in losses? Objection, Rebecca snapped. Relevance. Judge Whitaker looked over her glasses. Overruled. Answer the question. Christopher swallowed. Yes. Did those losses prompt your father to reassess executive oversight? Yes. Angela nodded once. No further questions. That was the pivot. Up until that moment, this had been framed as emotional injustice. Now it was corporate negligence. When it was my turn to testify, the room shifted. I walked to the stand, without looking at my brothers. State your name for the record. Evelyn Hart. Occupation, documentary photographer. Rebecca stood for cross. Miss Hart, would you agree that you were adopted into a position of privilege? Yes. Would you agree your brothers were raised from birth in that household? Yes. Would you agree that excluding them from the majority of the estate is extraordinary? Extraordinary doesn't mean invalid. A few people in the gallery shifted. Rebecca tried another angle. Did you ever encourage your father to change his will? No. Did you ever discuss your brother's performance in the company with him? I chose my words carefully. My father occasionally asked my opinion about leadership. I gave it honestly. What was that opinion? That leadership requires accountability. Rebecca paused. No further questions. Angela called her final witness, the forensic accountant. His testimony was dry, technical, exact. He detailed unauthorized real estate acquisitions, funded through corporate accounts, dates, wire transfers, signatures. $4.8 million. He confirmed documentation showing preparatory steps to move additional funds offshore. The word offshore hung in the room like a stain. Judge Whitaker's expression didn't change, but the energy did. During a recess, Daniel approached me outside the courtroom. You've gone too far, he said quietly. I didn't answer. You think exposing this makes you righteous? It makes it factual. He leaned closer. We could have handled this privately. You tried. His eyes hardened. You're destroying the family. I looked at him for a long moment. There was something almost tragic in his certainty. The family was already fractured the day you asked me to leave at 18. He stepped back as if I'd struck him. Christopher didn't speak during recess. He stood near the windows, staring out at the mountains beyond Santa Fe. When court resumed, closing arguments were concise. Rebecca emphasized tradition, bloodline, expectation. Angela emphasized documentation, governance, responsibility. Judge Whitaker took the matter under advisement. Ruling would be issued within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. In high-stakes litigation, that feels like 2 years. The media coverage intensified. Financial blogs dissected Hart Capital's structure. Business channels speculated about leadership transition. Former clients of Daniel's firm began distancing themselves. Christopher's real estate partnerships froze, pending outcome. Consequences don't explode. They erode. One evening, 3 days before the ruling, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. This is Assistant District Attorney Mark Feldman from Santa Fe County. I listened carefully. We've reviewed the derivative complaint and forensic findings. There may be grounds for a criminal investigation into what specifically potential embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. I closed my studio door. What are you asking from me? Cooperation, meaning testimony. Possibly. He paused. Miss Hart, if charges are filed, this escalates beyond probate. I understood that. Criminal court is not about family. It's about the state. After we ended the call, I sat alone in the dark. I thought about Richard's letter again. You were raised to build. I had never intended to dismantle anything, but sometimes rebuilding requires demolition. The ruling came on a Monday morning in December. Judge Whitaker's written decision was 23 pages long. I read it in Angela's office. The petition alleging undue influence is denied in full. The will stands. Control of Hart. Capital management remains vested in Evelyn Hart. Angela exhaled slowly. But the document didn't end there. The court finds sufficient evidence of potential fiduciary misconduct, warranting referral to the district attorney for review. Daniel's face, when he read it later that afternoon, would reportedly go pale. Christopher left the courthouse without speaking to reporters. The inheritance was settled, but the real war was only beginning. Because criminal charges once filed don't disappear quietly. And this time, I wasn't just defending an estate. I was defending the truth. Criminal investigations don't announce themselves with sirens. They begin with silence. 3 days after Judge Whitaker's ruling, Assistant District Attorney Mark Feldman asked me to come in voluntarily. No summons, no pressure, just a request. His office was plain. No mahogany panels, no inherited oil paintings, just files, fluorescent lights, and a whiteboard filled with timelines. Miss Hart, he began sliding a folder toward me. We're evaluating potential embezzlement charges against Daniel Hart and Christopher Hart in relation to Hart Capital Management. He didn't soften their names. This isn't about the inheritance, I said. No, it's about what happened before and after your father's death. He opened the folder. Wire transfers routed through subsidiary accounts. Personal property acquisitions booked as business assets. Draft emails referencing offshore contingencies. I studied the documents. My brothers had always moved confidently. Now that confidence was evidence. Mark looked at me steadily. We need to know if you'll cooperate fully, including providing internal communications and board access. I didn't hesitate. Yes, he nodded once. Good. Outside the courthouse, the air was sharp with early winter. Santa Fe always looks clean in December, as if snow can disguise history. Inside Hart Capital's headquarters, it was anything but clean. I walked into the executive conference room for the first time as controlling shareholder. The board members were already seated. Thomas Weller, senior partner, Janine Crawford, CFO, Elliot Granger, outside director. None of them stood when I entered. That was fine. Thomas cleared his throat. Evelyn, this situation is unfortunate. Unfortunate, I repeated calmly. Janine avoided my eyes. We need stability, Elliot added. Markets are sensitive. Stability requires transparency, I replied. Effective immediately. We're conducting a full internal compliance review. Thomas shifted. That could damage investor confidence. Damage already occurred, I said. We're correcting it. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. By the end, compliance protocols were approved unanimously, not because they respected me, because they feared investigation. Later that week, Daniel called. I considered letting it go to voicemail, I answered. You're testifying, aren't you? He asked. Yes, you're siding with the state against your own family. I leaned back in my chair. You sided with risk against the company. There was a pause. You think prison makes you powerful? No, accountability makes me free. He exhaled sharply. Christopher will never forgive you. Christopher had never forgiven me for existing. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I said quietly. I ended the call. The indictment came faster than I expected. A grand jury returned charges against Daniel Hart for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. Christopher was charged with conspiracy. The headlines were brutal. Hart brothers indicted in financial misconduct case. National media picked it up. The narrative flipped almost overnight. I wasn't the manipulative adoptee anymore. I was the whistleblower. That label felt heavy because I hadn't exposed them for attention. I'd exposed them because they wouldn't stop. The arraignment was held in January. Daniel stood before the judge without the polish he'd worn his entire life. Christopher remained composed, but his hands betrayed him. Angela sat beside me in the gallery. This is where they'll try to negotiate, she whispered. Daniel's attorney requested a continuance. Denied. Bail was set high. Christopher's counsel requested separation of trials. Granted. As the brothers exited, Daniel glanced toward me. Not with hatred, with disbelief. You were never supposed to stand here, his expression said. That was the point. Weeks passed in procedural motions and document exchanges. Meanwhile, Hart Capital stabilized. I appointed an interim COO, a woman named Sandra Kim from Phoenix, with 20 years of regulatory compliance experience. She didn't flinch at the chaos. We're going to survive this, she said during her first meeting, but not by pretending it didn't happen. I respected that. Outside the boardroom, my photography career quietly shifted. Public interest in my work surged. Interviews, feature requests. I declined most of them. This wasn't a brand campaign. It was survival. One evening, Lucas Moreno called. I've been watching the case, he said. I figured. You're handling this differently than most would. How so? You're not gloating. I smiled faintly. I don't need to. There was a pause. You look steady. I thought about that. I feel steady. The first plea offer arrived in February. Daniel's counsel proposed reduced charges in exchange for restitution in public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Christopher refused any plea discussion. Angela laid the options out carefully. If Daniel accepts, he avoids prison time. Probation finds restitution. And if he doesn't, trial. And the exposure gets worse. What about Christopher? He's betting on reasonable doubt. I stared at the ceiling of my studio that night. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was consequence. And consequence doesn't require cruelty. It requires consistency. I told Angela to accept no deal unless full restitution and admission were included. Weeks later, Daniel folded. He entered a guilty plea to reduced felony charges, probation, financial penalties, court-ordered repayment. Christopher doubled down. His trial was set for late spring. The family war had fractured into two paths, one brother bending, one brother refusing, and I realized something quietly important. The money no longer mattered. The inheritance had been secured. The company stabilized. What mattered now was something else. The question of whether blood entitles you to immunity. Christopher believed it did. The courtroom would decide otherwise. And when it did, there would be no more illusions left to protect him. Christopher never liked losing quietly. That's what separated him from Daniel. Daniel chased approval. Christopher chased control. His trial began in late April, when Santa Fe was bright and deceptively calm. Tourists filled the plaza. Galleries reopened their patios. The city looked indifferent to family collapse. Inside the courtroom, it was anything but calm. Assistant District Attorney Mark Feldman opened with facts, not theatrics. Mr. Christopher Hart authorized and co-signed financial transactions that diverted corporate funds for personal benefit. He was aware of executive risk exposure and facilitated concealment. No mention of adoption, no family drama, just numbers. Christopher's defense attorney, a sharp man named Richard Klein, framed it differently. My client trusted his brother. He signed documents presented to him in good faith. He was not the architect of these decisions. Trust. The irony of that word didn't escape me. I sat behind Angela, hands folded, listening, as emails were projected onto a screen. Christopher's name appeared beneath approval chains. Christopher's voice echoed in recorded board calls. Christopher's digital signature marked the real estate acquisitions. The jury watched without expression. During a recess, Christopher approached me. "This doesn't have to end like this," he said quietly. "It already has. You think this is justice? I think it's accurate." He studied my face. "You're enjoying watching us fall." "No." "Then why won't you stop it?" "Because I didn't start it." That landed harder than I expected. He looked away first. Back inside, Mark Feldman introduced a final piece of evidence, an internal memo written by Christopher 3 months before our parents died. Subject line, contingency strategy. The memo outlined asset protection plans in the event of unexpected governance transfer. He had anticipated the will change and prepared accordingly. When the prosecution rested, the air felt heavier. Christopher testified in his own defense. He was composed. "I never intended to harm the company," he said. "My father was volatile in his later years. We had to protect shareholder value." Mark rose slowly. "Protect it from whom?" "From instability." "Instability caused by what?" Christopher hesitated. "Personal decisions." Mark's voice remained steady. "Are you referring to your father's decision to transfer control to your sister?" Christopher didn't answer directly. The jury noticed. Closing arguments were concise. Richard Klein emphasized doubt. Mark emphasized documentation. The verdict came 2 days later. Guilty on conspiracy and breach of fiduciary duty. Not guilty on 2 lesser counts. Christopher's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes fractured. Sentencing was scheduled for June. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around the exit. I didn't stop. This wasn't a press tour. This was a reckoning. That evening, I received a letter from Christopher. Not through attorneys. Handwritten. You think you won. You didn't. This family will never be yours. I read it once and burned it in the sink. Because belonging had stopped being something I sought. Daniel began probation quietly. He left Santa Fe. Moved to Phoenix, I heard. Christopher awaited sentencing under supervision. The Hart name no longer opened doors the way it once had. Hart Capital stabilized fully under Sandra Kim's leadership and my oversight. We divested from high-risk sectors, increased compliance transparency, instituted independent audits. Investors returned, not because of loyalty, because of performance. One afternoon, I stood alone in the mansion courtyard, where I had once felt temporary. The fountain still ran. The air still carried the scent of lavender, but it didn't feel like home. It felt like architecture. I listed it for sale the following week. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Lucas called that evening. You're closing chapters fast. I don't want them half open. He paused. You don't seem angry. I'm not. Then, what are you certain? Sentencing day arrived in June. Christopher stood before the judge. The sentence was measured. 18 months in a federal correctional facility. Restitution. Lifetime ban from executive financial management roles. Not catastrophic, but permanent. As he was escorted out, he didn't look at me. That told me everything. Because hatred requires connection. Indifference ends it. The war for inheritance was over. The criminal cases were closing. The company was stable, and yet something remained unfinished. Not legally, personally, because money and verdicts don't resolve identity. They clarify it, and in the quiet that followed, I had to decide who I was without opposition. The next chapter wasn't about courtrooms. It was about choice, and this time, no one else would define it for me. When the mansion closed, I didn't attend the final walkthrough. I signed the documents in Angela Reyes's office and let the realtor handle the rest. 6 bedrooms, courtyard fountain, oil paintings I never chose. Sold for $26.4 million to a tech executive relocating from Austin. The headlines called it a strategic asset liquidation. That wasn't wrong, but it also wasn't the whole truth. I didn't want to live inside a monument to conditional belonging. The sale cleared in July. After taxes, fees, and trust allocations, the proceeds folded cleanly into the estate portfolio. Hart Capital continued operating out of its downtown Santa Fe offices. I moved into a smaller property just outside town. 3 bedrooms, adobe walls, no gate. I didn't need gates anymore. Daniel called once more before the summer ended. Probation suited him poorly. You've erased us, he said. No, you erased yourselves. You could have settled. You tried to settle by hiding losses and moving money offshore. He exhaled sharply. You never understood how the firm worked. I understand exactly how it worked. Silence lingered. Then he said something almost fragile. Dad wouldn't have wanted this. I thought about that. Dad didn't want losses either. The line went quiet. Daniel never called again. Christopher began serving his sentence in early August. Through counsel, he requested mediation. Angela brought me the proposal. He wants to discuss reconciliation before reporting to the facility. Reconciliation, I repeated. Financial terms are settled. This would be personal. I considered it for the full day. Then I agreed. Not for closure, for clarity. We met in a conference room at his attorney's office. No reporters, no board members. Just Christopher, his lawyer, Richard Klein, Angela, and me. Christopher looked thinner, not physically, structurally. He didn't start with apology. He started with accusation. You changed the narrative. No, you exposed it. He leaned back. You think the company is safer with you. Yes, because you don't understand ambition. Ambition without restraint isn't leadership. He studied me. You always thought you were better. No, I always knew I was capable. That difference seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. He looked down at the table. When Dad updated the will, he didn't tell us. He didn't tell me either. Christopher shook his head slightly. You were never supposed to carry it. Carry what? The legacy. I met his gaze. Legacy isn't blood. It's responsibility. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Regret, maybe, or just the recognition that the structure he trusted had failed him. He spoke quietly. Prison isn't going to fix this. It's not meant to. Then, what is it meant to do? Mark consequence. He didn't respond. The mediation ended without ceremony. No handshake. No reconciliation. But no threats either. Sometimes peace isn't warmth. It's absence of escalation. In the months that followed, I made decisions that surprised even Angela. I restructured Heart Capital into a publicly accountable entity with external oversight, reduced my direct executive compensation by 30%, redirected $15 million into a foundation supporting investigative journalism and ethical corporate governance training. The foundation's name wasn't Heart. It was Meridian, direction without attachment. Sandra Kim approved the restructuring plan with measured respect. You're not consolidating power, she said. No, you're decentralizing it. Yes, she nodded once. That's rare. Outside the boardroom, my photography returned to center. I began a long-term project documenting white-collar criminal rehabilitation programs. Not because of Christopher, because accountability doesn't end with sentencing. Lucas visited one weekend in September. He walked through the adobe house slowly. This feels like you, he said. It does. We sat outside at dusk. You didn't take revenge the way people expected, he observed. No, you didn't crush them. I didn't need to. He smiled faintly. You let the system do it. I let truth do it. There's a difference. He looked at me carefully. Are you lonely? I thought about that longer than I expected. No. Are you? Sometimes. We didn't rush the answer, because after years of war, silence can be peaceful, not empty, peaceful. In October, I received a letter from the federal facility. Christopher. I almost didn't open it, but I did. He didn't apologize. He wrote about routine, about structure, about boredom. At the end, one sentence stood alone. You were stronger than we realized. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not for sentiment, for record, because strength isn't something I performed. It's something I became, and becoming doesn't require permission. By November, the media had moved on. Heart Capital stabilized. Daniel faded into consultancy work in Arizona. Christopher adjusted to incarceration. The foundation launched its first fellowship program. Investors praised transparency. The tables had turned, not loudly, not theatrically, but undeniably. And for the first time in years, I woke up without bracing for impact. The war was over. What remained was choice. And choice, I've learned, is the only inheritance that truly matters. The first holiday season after the trials felt unfamiliar. Not painful, just unfamiliar. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't bracing for a Thanksgiving dinner thick with tension or a Christmas gathering shaped by favoritism and silent manipulation. There was no mansion this year. No long table set beneath oil portraits. No Daniel correcting waitstaff. No Christopher calculating who spoke to whom. Instead, I hosted a small dinner at the adobe house. Sandra Kim came. So did two board members and one of my photography assistants, Mia Torres, who had nowhere else to go that week. We didn't talk about the case. We talked about projects, travel, food. At one point, Mia looked around the table and said almost casually, "This feels steady." The word landed. Steady. That's what my life had become. Not glamorous, not dramatic, steady. After dinner, when everyone left, I stood alone in the quiet kitchen and realized something I hadn't allowed myself to process. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Daniel, not at Christopher, not even at Margaret for her careful language, or Richard for his measured distance. Anger requires active tension. I didn't feel tense. A week later, I received a call from an unfamiliar New York number. "This is Andrea Klein from the Atlantic Review. We'd like to feature your foundation and your recent governance restructuring." I hesitated. Public exposure hadn't been my goal, but transparency was. If we do this, I said, it's about systems, not spectacle. Understood. The interview ran in December. The headline read, "From Inheritance War to Ethical Reform, How One Heir Rebuilt a Company." It avoided the word revenge. Good, because what I had done wasn't revenge. It was correction. That distinction mattered. A few days after publication, Daniel sent a brief email. Saw the article. You always liked cameras. That was it. No accusation, no sarcasm, just acknowledgement. I replied with a single sentence. Take care of yourself. He didn't respond. Christopher's second letter arrived just before Christmas. Different tone, more direct. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm writing because I realize I built my identity around proximity to power. When that shifted, I didn't know who I was. I read it slowly. That sentence was more honest than anything he'd said in court. I didn't reply, not because I couldn't, because some growth isn't a conversation. It's solitary. On Christmas morning, I drove north toward Taos with my camera. Snow covered the desert in a way that felt almost impossible. I photographed abandoned barns against white sky, structures that once meant livelihood, now empty, still standing. There's something about photographing aftermath that feels familiar to me. Not because I'm drawn to destruction, because I understand reconstruction. In January, the Meridian Foundation awarded its first investigative journalism grant. The recipient was a reporter named Julian Park, who had exposed municipal corruption in Nevada. During the ceremony, he shook my hand and said, "This kind of backing changes everything." That's when I understood the final layer of this story. Inheritance can destroy families, but capital, when redirected, can build accountability. Hart Capital's annual performance report, released in February, stable growth, reduced volatility, increased investor trust. Sandra presented the numbers calmly. Markets respond well to integrity, she said. I smiled slightly. That sentence would have unsettled my brothers more than any verdict. In early spring, Lucas moved to Santa Fe permanently. Not for me, for his own practice expansion. We didn't rush into declarations. We built slowly. Dinner, work, shared mornings. No one was trying to inherit anyone else's life. One evening, sitting outside beneath a sky that felt endless, Lucas asked quietly, "Do you ever wish it had gone differently?" I thought about that. About 18-year-old me packing a suitcase. About the will reading. About the courtroom. No, he studied my face. Not even the part where they pushed you out. Especially that part. Because if they hadn't, I might never have built anything on my own. He nodded. You don't carry it like a wound. I carry it like proof. Proof that exclusion doesn't erase you. Proof that favoritism collapses under scrutiny. Proof that justice can be methodical instead of loud. Christopher's release date was set for the following year, reduced for good behavior. Daniel remained in Arizona, quietly rebuilding his own professional life. We weren't reconciled. We weren't enemies. We were separate. And separation, I've learned, is sometimes the healthiest boundary. By the end of spring, I walked through Hart Capital's offices without anyone questioning my presence. Not because they feared me, because they respected the structure. Authority earned feels different than authority inherited. And I had finally internalized that difference. The story people expected was revenge, public humiliation, financial domination, total collapse. That's not what happened. What happened was slower, more deliberate, more permanent. The tables turned, not with shouting, with documentation. And when they did, I didn't gloat. I adjusted, because control isn't about winning. It's about knowing when you no longer need to fight. And for the first time since that will was read, I no longer felt like I was defending my existence. I was simply living it. The final chapter wasn't about money. It was about identity, and mine was finally mine. Christopher was released on a gray morning in late October. I knew the date before anyone told me. Not because I tracked him, because accountability doesn't end at sentencing. It evolves. 18 months earlier, He had walked into a federal facility, still convinced the system was flawed. Now he was walking out into a world that had moved on without him. Daniel didn't call me that day. Sandra didn't mention it at the office. No headlines ran about his release. The silence was intentional. When a story stops feeding outrage, it starves. 3 days after his release, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Christopher. Not a letter this time. A simple text. "I'm back in Santa Fe. I won't cause problems." I stared at it for a long moment, then replied, "That's not something you need to promise me. It's something you prove." He didn't respond. At Hart Capital, the annual board review approached. This would be the first one since the restructuring. Thomas Weller cleared his throat as usual. Performance metrics show stable returns. Risk exposure reduced by 42% year over year. Janine Crawford added, "Investor confidence has rebounded significantly." No one mentioned my brothers. Not because they forgot, because relevance fades when accountability stands. After the meeting, Sandra stayed behind. "You're not running this like a dynasty," she said. "No, you're running it like infrastructure." That word felt right. Infrastructure isn't emotional. It's functional. Meanwhile, the Meridian Foundation expanded into corporate ethics education. We launched seminars for mid-level executives on fiduciary responsibility and transparent governance. During one session in Denver, an attendee asked, "Is this personal for you?" I answered honestly, "Yes." "Does that bias you?" "No. It clarifies me." There's a difference. In November, Christopher requested to meet again. This time, no lawyers, just a cafe downtown. I considered declining, then accepted. He looked older, not dramatically, but differently anchored. We sat across from each other with coffee between us. "You sold the house," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I didn't need it." He nodded slowly. "I walked past it last week. It looks smaller. Perspective does that." He looked at his hands. "I thought prison would make me angry." "Did it?" "No. It made me quiet. Quiet can be useful." He studied my face. "Do you hate me?" "No." "Do you forgive me?" "Forgiveness isn't a transaction, Christopher." He absorbed that. "I was wrong," he said finally. That was the closest he had ever come to apology. "I didn't dramatize it. I appreciate you saying that." Silence settled between us. Not hostile, not warm, balanced. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "You didn't destroy me," he said. "You did that yourself. And you didn't stop me." "No." "Why?" "Because I wasn't responsible for protecting you from your own decisions." He nodded once. Then he walked away. That was the closest we came to reconciliation. Not a reunion, an understanding. Daniel remained distant. Occasionally, I heard through industry channels that he was consulting for smaller firms in Phoenix. He never contacted Christopher publicly. The brothers, once inseparable in entitlement, had grown apart under consequence. In December, the Meridian Foundation hosted its first national conference on corporate accountability. Executives, journalists, legal scholars. Lucas moderated a panel on ethical enforcement. During my closing remarks, I said something I hadn't rehearsed. Inheritance isn't just money. It's culture. And culture either protects accountability or excuses misconduct. The room went still. Afterward, a woman in her 60s approached me. "I adopted my daughter when she was 5, she said. "I hope I give her something better than entitlement." "You will," I replied, "if you teach her responsibility instead of ownership." She squeezed my hand. That moment meant more than the verdict ever did. Christmas came quietly again. This time, I didn't host. Lucas and I drove to Colorado for a small gathering with his colleagues. No grand dining table, no tension over who sits where. Just conversation. On Christmas morning, my phone buzzed. "Daniel." "Merry Christmas," he wrote. I waited before responding. "Merry Christmas." That was all. Sometimes healing is minimal. Not grand, minimal. In early January, Hart Capital received an award from a regional business association for transparency reforms. I accepted it on behalf of the company. Not as triumph, as acknowledgement. On the drive home, I thought about the word revenge. People use it loosely. They imagine spectacle. But real revenge, if you insist on calling it that, isn't destruction. It's independence. It's stability in the face of attempted exclusion. It's building something so structured that manipulation collapses under its own weight. The tables turned, not because I flipped them, because I reinforced the floor. And when you reinforce the floor, unstable structures fall naturally. Christopher kept his promise. He caused no problems. He found modest work in a logistics firm under supervision. Daniel continued rebuilding quietly. We weren't a restored family. We were separate individuals, and that separation was healthier than forced unity. As the new year settled in, I realized something simple. I no longer measured my life against theirs. Not success, not failure, just forward motion. The inheritance war that once defined every headline had become background noise. And what remained was something steadier than revenge. It was authorship of my life, on my terms, without needing anyone else's approval. The first time I walked into Hart Capital's annual shareholder meeting as its uncontested chair, no one questioned my presence. That detail mattered more than applause ever could. The ballroom at La Fonda was filled with investors, analysts, and regional partners. Screens displayed performance charts, compliance reports, risk assessments. Numbers don't lie when you stop trying to manipulate them. Sandra Kim opened the session with quarterly summaries. Growth stable at 8.3%. Risk exposure contained within conservative thresholds. External audits clean. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't reference the past. No mention of indictment. No inheritance drama. Just this: accountability is not a crisis response. It's a system. There was no dramatic pause, just quiet attention. After the meeting, Thomas Weller approached me. I underestimated you, he said plainly. Yes, you did. He didn't flinch. That won't happen again. Respect earned slowly feels different than respect demanded. Meanwhile, the Meridian Foundation launched a new initiative in partnership with 3 universities. Graduate fellowships in corporate ethics and investigative reporting. One of the students, a young woman named Riley Chen, asked me during a Q&A session, "Do you ever worry that your position was still ultimately handed to you?" I appreciated the question. It was honest. Yes, I said. I inherited control, but I earned legitimacy. She nodded thoughtfully. That's a distinction people miss. Exactly. Because inheritance gives you access. It does not guarantee trust. In March, Daniel unexpectedly attended a public ethics symposium hosted by the foundation. I saw him in the back row. He didn't approach me afterward, but he stayed through the entire program, listening. That alone said more than words. Christopher continued keeping distance. Occasionally, industry whispers reached me that he had declined offers involving executive authority. Good. Rebuilding should begin without leverage. Lucas and I moved slowly but steadily into shared routines. He never asked about control of the company, never asked about money. We spoke about photography projects, legal reform travel. One night, sitting under a sky that felt wide enough to absorb everything that had happened, he said quietly, "You don't lead like someone proving something." I'm not proving anything anymore. Then, what are you doing? Maintaining. Maintenance isn't glamorous. It's necessary. In late spring, a letter arrived from Margaret's sister, Aunt Lorraine. We hadn't spoken in years. I expected criticism. Instead, the letter read, "I was wrong about you. I assumed blood mattered more than character. Watching you handle this changed that." I read it twice, then placed it beside Christopher's earlier letter. 2 acknowledgments, different tones, same realization. That summer, Hart Capital finalized a partnership with a renewable infrastructure firm based in Oregon. The deal required weeks of negotiation. At one point, their CEO leaned across the table and said, "Given your family history, how do we know governance won't fracture again?" Fair question. Because our structure doesn't depend on one family anymore, I replied. It depends on documented oversight. He nodded slowly. That answer closed the deal. In July, the final restitution payment from Daniel cleared. Every dollar accounted for. Angela called to confirm. "That's the last of it," she said. "No more open matters. No more litigation. No more pending hearings. The war legally was finished, but emotional residue lingers longer than paperwork." One evening, Christopher showed up unannounced at my office. Not aggressive, not desperate, just present. "We need to talk," he said. "About what?" "About what comes next." I didn't invite him in immediately. Then I stepped aside. He stood near the window, looking out over downtown Santa Fe. "I've been offered a position in Chicago," he said. "Mid-level operations, no executive title." "That sounds appropriate." He almost smiled. "You're not going to object." "Why would I?" "Because it moves me away." I looked at him carefully. Distance was never the issue, Christopher. Integrity was. He absorbed that. "I'm not asking to be part of Hart Capital again." "Good. I just wanted you to know." I nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated. "I don't expect us to be close." "We won't be, but we don't have to be enemies either." "That's up to you." He held my gaze for a moment, then extended his hand. It wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. I shook it. After he left, I stood alone in the quiet office. The same office that had once felt hostile. Now it felt neutral. Stability isn't loud. It's consistent. By autumn, the Meridian Foundation had expanded into 5 states. Media attention had cooled. That was good. Attention is volatile. Structure endures. On the anniversary of the will reading, I visited the cathedral where the funeral had taken place. Not for grief, for perspective. Standing beneath high ceilings, I thought about the girl who left at 18, about the woman who sat in probate court, about the person I am now. I didn't win because I was adopted. I didn't win because I was strategic. I didn't even win because the law sided with me. I prevailed because I refused to collapse under exclusion. There's a difference, and that difference shaped everything that followed. As I stepped outside into the bright New Mexico air, I realized something quietly important. I no longer thought of this story as a battle. It had become a foundation, not of money, of identity. An identity once earned doesn't require defense. It simply exists. The year after Christopher moved to Chicago was the quietest year of my life. No subpoenas, no headlines, no boardroom confrontations disguised as strategy. Just structure. Hart Capital closed its strongest fiscal year in 2 decades. 12% growth, 0 regulatory flags. Independent audit clean for the 3rd consecutive cycle. Sandra Kim handed me the final report in December. "You've made this boring," she said. "Good. Boring is sustainable." She smiled faintly. "You know, most family-run firms implode within 1 generation of transition. I'm not running a family firm." That was the point. The Meridian Foundation, now operating in 7 states, funded investigative projects, uncovering municipal fraud and corporate tax evasion schemes. I didn't attend every event anymore. Leadership isn't micromanagement. It's architecture. Daniel sent an email in early January. Short, direct. "I'm getting married in April. Small ceremony. You're invited if you'd like to come." I read it twice. For years, Daniel's milestones excluded me by design. This time, inclusion wasn't an obligation. It was a choice. I responded the next morning. "Thank you. I'll attend." The wedding was held in Sedona. Red Rocks, minimal guests, no grandeur. When I arrived, Daniel looked almost surprised. "You came," he said. "You invited me." He nodded. His fiancée, Laura Bennett, extended her hand warmly. "I've heard about you," she said. "I imagine you have. Only good things." That made me pause. During the reception, Daniel pulled me aside. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness." "You don't need to earn it." He frowned slightly. "Then, what is this?" "It's neutrality." He seemed to consider that. "Is that better?" "It's healthier." He exhaled slowly. "Laura tells me I measure everything in wins and losses. You used to, and now I measure stability." He looked at me differently then. Not threatened, not defensive, Curious, the ceremony ended without incident. No dramatic reconciliation, no public embrace, just coexistence. Christopher didn't attend. He sent Daniel a brief message instead. I heard about it later. Life was moving, not backward, forward. In March, Lucas proposed. No spectacle, just the two of us, at dusk, outside the adobe house. He didn't mention money, didn't reference legacy. He said one thing: I want to build something steady with you. That word again. Steady? I said yes. The engagement wasn't a headline. We kept it quiet. I had no interest in turning personal milestones into public optics. Hart Capital's board approved a long-term succession framework that did not center on me as sole decision-maker. Rotational leadership, independent trustees, transparent oversight. Thomas Weller shook his head slightly during the vote. You're designing this so no one can consolidate power the way your brothers did. Yes, he almost smiled. You're designing it so you can walk away someday. Also, yes, because ownership isn't meant to imprison. It's meant to function. In late spring, Christopher visited Santa Fe again. This time, not to negotiate, not to argue, just to inform. I've been promoted, he said. Mid-level operations director. Nothing flashy. Congratulations, he hesitated. I wanted you to hear it from me. I appreciate that. He looked around my office. You changed everything. No, I adjusted it. He nodded. I used to think you were lucky. I wasn't. You were prepared. That felt like the final shift. Not apology. Acknowledgement. When he left, there was no tension in the room. Just closure. Daniel and Laura announced they were expecting a child. He sent me the ultrasound photo. No commentary. Just an image. I responded with a simple line. Take care of them. In July, the Meridian Foundation partnered with a federal ethics oversight committee to develop new compliance training modules for corporate boards. I was invited to testify before a Senate subcommittee on fiduciary responsibility. The hearing room felt different than probate court. Not adversarial, policy-focused. One senator asked, "What was the turning point in your case?" I answered without hesitation. Documentation, not emotion. Emotion tells stories. Documentation changes outcomes. The hearing concluded without spectacle. That night, sitting on the porch with Lucas, I realized something that surprised me. I no longer thought about being adopted, not as identity, not as origin. It had shaped my resilience, but it no longer defined my trajectory. I wasn't the excluded daughter. I wasn't the unexpected heir. I wasn't even the whistleblower. I was simply Evelyn Hart. That clarity felt earned. The anniversary of my 18th birthday came quietly that year. No ceremony, no memory replay, just a date on a calendar. I remembered packing my suitcase, Daniel leaning against the desk. You've had your shot. He was wrong. I hadn't had my shot. I built it, and that distinction had changed everything. The final court paperwork officially closed in early autumn. All restitution complete. All penalties served. No pending appeals. Angela called one last time regarding the case. That's it, she said. It's over. It was. Legally, emotionally, structurally. The war had ended long ago. What remained was life. And life, when stripped of conflict, is surprisingly quiet. Not dramatic, not vengeful, just intentional. The final chapter wasn't about defeating anyone. It was about deciding who I would be without opposition. And I already knew the answer. The day I signed the final governance transition documents, there were no cameras in the room, no reporters, no dramatic speeches, just signatures. Hart Capital's new charter formalized independent oversight, rotating executive authority, and an external ethics committee with veto power over major financial risk exposure. My role shifted from controlling shareholder to long-term strategic advisor. I kept equity. I released control. Because ownership had never been about dominance. It had been about stability. Sandra Kim shook my hand after the vote passed unanimously. You built something that can survive you, she said. That's the goal. Power that depends on one person isn't strength. It's fragility. The Meridian Foundation continued expanding without requiring my constant presence. Young investigators now led projects I once would have overseen personally. Systems had replaced personality. That mattered. Lucas and I married quietly in early spring. Small ceremony, close friends, no extended family drama. Daniel attended with Laura and their infant son. Christopher sent a handwritten note from Chicago. "I'm glad you built something real." That was enough. No confrontation, no tension, just acknowledgement of distance. After the ceremony, Daniel approached me while guests drifted toward the courtyard. "You look settled," he said. "I am." He hesitated. "I used to think inheritance was about proving we were worthy of Dad. And now I think it's about what we build without him." I nodded. That's the part he understood in the end. Daniel looked down briefly. He didn't know how to say more. He didn't need to. Christopher visited Santa Fe later that summer for work. We met briefly for coffee. No tension, no accusations. He spoke about operational efficiencies and modest professional progress. I listened. When we stood to leave, he said something simple. "You didn't ruin us." "No, we were already unstable." He nodded. That was the closest thing to shared truth we had ever reached. Years earlier, when Harold Whitmore read the will aloud, I thought the number 82 million was the story. It wasn't. The number was just a catalyst. What mattered was exposure. Favoritism exposed. Manipulation exposed. Entitlement exposed. And once exposed, those structures couldn't sustain themselves. People often ask whether this was revenge. It wasn't. Revenge seeks spectacle. This was restraint, documentation, boundaries enforced through systems instead of shouting. The tables turned because they were built unevenly to begin with. All I did was level them. If you followed this story from the beginning, you know it never required me to destroy anyone. It required me to stand still long enough for truth to surface. That's harder than retaliation, harder than anger, harder than public humiliation. It's also more permanent. My relationship with Daniel is functional. Occasional messages, family updates. My relationship with Christopher is distant, but civil. No closeness, no hostility, just space. Space, I've learned, is sometimes the healthiest boundary in a toxic family dynamic. Heart Capital operates without drama. The Meridian Foundation funds accountability without my name at the center. Lucas and I built a life where decisions aren't measured by inheritance, but by intention. And me, I still photograph truth. Rural communities adapting to economic change. Executives rebuilding reputations after corporate collapse. Families navigating quiet fractures. Because I understand something now I didn't at 18. Being excluded doesn't mean you lack value. It means the structure you're standing in can't recognize it. You don't beg the structure to change. You build a better one. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been the outsider in your own family, the adopted child, the overlooked sibling, the one told you didn't belong, remember this. Belonging isn't granted by blood. It's established by character. Inheritance isn't proof of worth. Responsibility is. And revenge, if you insist on calling it that, is living so steadily that the people who try to erase you are forced to confront their own instability. If you made it this far, thank you. Like, comment, subscribe. Not because this is a spectacle, but because steady stories matter. And sometimes the quietest victories